He thought humiliating her would entertain the entire room. But in that moment, he had no idea he had just stepped into his own downfall. The private dining hall of Bennett's, a Michelin-starred restaurant where every plate cost over $400, shimmered under golden chandeliers, crystal glasses catching the light as the city's elite leaned back in tailored suits and silk dresses, their laughter soft but sharp, the kind that judged without words. Chef Lucas Bennett stood at the center of it all, his reputation as untouchable as the awards lining his office walls, his voice smooth but edged with arrogance as his eyes landed on the woman near the entrance, Claire Whitman, dressed in a simple beige cardigan and worn flats that echoed quietly against the polished marble floor. She didn't belong here, not by their standards, and the room knew it before she even spoke. Whispers drifted like smoke, subtle glances exchanged, a quiet agreement forming without a single sentence spoken aloud. Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were an unexpected interruption, something mildly amusing to break the monotony of perfection. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested the opposite, and Claire's voice, soft and steady, barely carried past the nearest table as she replied that she had a reservation, a statement that drew a few raised eyebrows and a muted chuckle from a guest seated nearby. Lucas smiled then, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, and in that instant, a decision formed, quick and effortless, the kind that came from years of never being challenged. He would turn this into a spectacle. "A reservation," he repeated, just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, and the room leaned in without appearing to, curiosity flickering beneath polished exteriors. Claire stood still, her posture composed, her hands loosely folded, as if she had stepped into rooms like this before, though nothing about her appearance supported that assumption. Lucas gestured toward the open kitchen, stainless steel gleaming under bright white lights, the controlled chaos of fine dining humming just beyond the glass partition. "Tell you what," he said, his voice now carrying, inviting attention, "why don't you join us tonight, in the kitchen?" And a ripple of laughter followed, light but unmistakable, the kind that turned a moment into a stage. Claire's eyes lifted slightly, meeting his for the first time, and for a fraction of a second, something unreadable passed between them, something Lucas dismissed just as quickly as he noticed it. "Cook for us," he continued, now fully committed. "Let's see what you can do." And the words hung in the air, like a challenge wrapped in politeness. A guest raised a phone discreetly. Another leaned forward, interest sharpening as the night shifted from predictable luxury to unexpected entertainment. Claire didn't respond immediately, and in that silence, the room filled the gap with assumptions, with quiet judgments already forming conclusions. Lucas took a step back, folding his arms, confident, certain of the outcome, certain of the role each person in the room would play. But Claire's expression didn't break, didn't flinch, didn't reveal the embarrassment they expected. Instead, her gaze moved past him, toward the kitchen, toward the knives, the burners, the precise choreography of chefs moving in practiced rhythm. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, not in fear, but in something else, something quieter, deeper, almost like recognition. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, measured, almost too steady for the moment. "Just one dish," she said, and for the first time that night, the room didn't laugh right away, because something in the way she said it didn't sound like a joke at all. The laughter faded slower this time, uncertain, as if the room itself was trying to decide whether this was still a joke or something else entirely. Claire stepped forward without waiting for permission, her quiet footsteps echoing against the marble as she moved toward the open kitchen, and for the first time, the chefs inside paused, their movements stuttering just slightly as they noticed her approach. Lucas watched closely, his expression composed, but his eyes sharpening with interest, because something about her calm did not match the humiliation he had carefully constructed. "All right," he said, gesturing toward an empty station, his tone now edged with curiosity disguised as control. "Let us see what you can do." And the staff parted just enough to give her space, though their glances carried skepticism, amusement, even mild irritation at the disruption. Claire reached the counter and rested her hands lightly against the cool steel surface, her fingers brushing the edge as if reacquainting themselves with something familiar. and then she looked up, scanning the ingredients laid out across the kitchen with a focus that did not belong to a beginner. "What would you like me to prepare?" she asked, and Lucas did not hesitate. Already prepared for this moment, already imagining the outcome. "A 5-course tasting dish," he replied, deliberately vague yet impossibly demanding. "Something worthy of this room." And a murmur spread among the guests, some leaning closer, others lifting their phones higher, anticipating failure dressed as entertainment. Claire nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if accepting terms in a negotiation no one else could hear. And then she turned back to the station, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly, the subtle shift of someone stepping into a role they knew too well. She reached for a knife, not hurried, not hesitant, but with a precision that caused the nearest sous chef to pause mid-movement, his eyes narrowing as he watched her grip. The angle, the balance, all of it just slightly too perfect to dismiss. The room did not notice yet, but the kitchen did. Claire began selecting ingredients, not randomly, not experimentally, but with intention, her hands moving across herbs, proteins, oils, as if she already knew exactly what she would create before a single cut was made. Lucas folded his arms tighter, his confidence still intact, but something in his gaze shifted, a flicker of calculation replacing pure amusement. "Do not take too long," he added, his voice carrying again, trying to reassert control, and a few guests chuckled, reassured by his tone, by the familiar hierarchy being restored. Claire did not respond. Instead, she placed the first ingredient on the board, and when the blade met the surface, the sound was clean, sharp, controlled, cutting through the ambient noise like a signal no one had expected. Slice after slice followed, even, measured, efficient, each movement flowing into the next without hesitation, without wasted motion, and the sous chef who had been watching stepped closer without realizing it, drawn in by something he could not immediately explain. Claire's expression remained calm, her eyes steady, her breathing slow, as if the room beyond the kitchen had disappeared entirely. She adjusted the heat on a pan with a quick, precise turn, not checking, not guessing, simply knowing. And when the oil shimmered at exactly the right moment, she added the ingredients with a timing that made another chef glance at Lucas, uncertain now. The laughter in the dining room softened, replaced by a quieter attention, a subtle shift from mockery to curiosity. Lucas straightened slightly, his jaw tightening just enough to betray the first crack in his certainty, because what he was seeing did not align with the narrative he had built. Claire continued, layering flavors, adjusting textures, her hands moving faster now, but never rushed, every motion deliberate, every second accounted for. And somewhere between the first cut and the rising aroma that began to drift into the dining room, the balance of the room started to change, though no one had yet found the words to explain why. The aroma reached the dining room before anyone realized it, subtle at first, then unmistakable, rich and layered in a way that did not belong to improvisation. And conversations began to falter as heads turned toward the kitchen, curiosity replacing amusement one quiet second at a time. Claire moved with a rhythm that no longer resembled someone proving a point, but someone returning to something deeply ingrained. Her hands steady as she adjusted seasoning without tasting, her timing exact, down to the second. And the sous chefs who had once watched with mild interest now stood completely still, their attention fixed on every movement she made. One of them leaned slightly toward another and whispered something under his breath, but the words never reached the room because the realization forming in the kitchen had not yet found its voice. Lucas took a step closer, just one, subtle enough that most guests would not notice, but those inside the kitchen felt it immediately, the shift in his presence, the way his eyes no longer carried amusement, but something sharper, something searching. Claire plated the first component with deliberate care, her fingers placing each element with a precision that bordered on instinct, and when she wiped the edge of the plate clean with a cloth, the gesture was so automatic, so practiced, that one of the line cooks unconsciously mirrored the motion with his own station, as if reminded of a standard he had not seen executed this flawlessly in years. The room grew quieter, not silent yet, but moving toward it, drawn in by something they could not fully explain. Lucas folded his arms again, but this time it was different, tighter, less relaxed. his posture no longer that of a man entertaining himself, but one trying to understand something that did not fit. "What exactly are you making?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier theatrical tone, and Claire did not look up as she answered, her voice calm, almost distant. "Something simple." And the word simple landed differently this time, not as modesty, but as control. She moved to the stove again, adjusting heat with a quick motion that matched the exact point where the sauce reached its peak, and when she lifted the pan, the consistency held perfectly, coating the back of the spoon in a way that made one of the senior chefs inhale sharply before catching himself. A guest near the front table leaned forward, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition, though he could not yet place why, and the phone in his hand slowly lowered as if the moment demanded more attention than documentation. Claire continued, assembling the final elements, each step flowing into the next with no hesitation, no wasted movement. And the kitchen, once filled with the usual controlled chaos, now stood in complete stillness, every eye on her, every breath measured. Lucas watched her hands, not her face, noticing details he had missed before. The angle of the knife, the confidence in her posture, the absence of doubt in every motion, and a thought began to form, faint but persistent, something he could not ignore any longer. He stepped even closer now, close enough to see the smallest details. And when Claire reached for a finishing ingredient, something rare, something usually reserved for his most exclusive dishes, she handled it without hesitation, without asking, as if she had every right to. The room beyond the glass had gone, almost completely silent now, the earlier laughter replaced by a tension that pressed against the air itself. And when Claire finally set the completed dish onto the counter, the presentation flawless, balanced, undeniably refined, no one spoke. Lucas stared at the plate, his expression unreadable for a brief second, and then something shifted, subtle but undeniable, as recognition began to surface, slow and unwelcome. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words did not come immediately, because for the first time that night, certainty had left him, and in its place was something far more dangerous, doubt. No one reached for the plate at first, not even the staff, as if the dish itself demanded a moment of silence before judgment could be passed. The air in the room had changed completely, no longer light with amusement, but heavy with anticipation, and Lucas stood there staring, his mind working faster than his expression allowed, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with the assumption he had made only minutes ago. "Serve it," he finally said, though his voice carried none of its earlier confidence, and one of the servers stepped forward carefully, almost cautiously, lifting the plate as if it carried more than just food. Every movement felt amplified now, the soft clink of porcelain, the faint rustle of fabric, the quiet shift of chairs as guests leaned in, their attention fully captured. The plate was set before the nearest guest, a man who had been among the first to laugh, and now his smile had faded into something more serious, more uncertain. He picked up his fork, slowly, glancing once at Lucas as if seeking reassurance, but Lucas offered none, his eyes fixed entirely on the dish. The fork cut through effortlessly, the texture yielding with a precision that spoke of perfect timing, and when the first bite was taken, the reaction was immediate, though not loud. The man froze, his expression shifting in a way that words could not keep up with, his brows tightening slightly before his eyes widened just enough to betray surprise. He did not speak right away, and that silence spread outward, table by table, until the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Well?" someone asked from across the table, unable to contain the tension, and the man set his fork down slowly, his gaze still on the plate as if trying to understand it. "This," he began, but stopped, searching for the right word, then shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. "This is not beginner cooking." And a ripple moved through the room, quiet but powerful. Another guest leaned forward, taking a bite without waiting for permission, and the reaction repeated, subtle but unmistakable, a shared realization forming piece by piece. Lucas stepped closer now, close enough to smell the dish himself, the aroma confirming what his instincts had already begun to tell him. And for the first time, he looked at Claire not as an outsider, but as a variable he had misjudged. "Who taught you?" he asked, the question sharper now, edged with something that sounded almost like urgency. and Claire finally looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the shift in the room had nothing to do with her. "I learned a long time ago," she replied, her voice steady, offering nothing more, and that lack of explanation only deepened the tension. Lucas studied her face, searching for recognition, for a clue he might have missed, and in the back of his mind, something stirred, a memory he could not fully grasp yet, but one that refused to stay buried. The kitchen staff exchanged glances, their earlier skepticism gone, replaced by a quiet respect that no one had announced, but everyone felt. Claire turned back to the station, already preparing the next component without waiting for approval, as if she had moved beyond the need for validation. Entirely. And that was when Lucas realized something unsettling. He was no longer in control of the moment. The room that had once followed his lead now watched her instead, their attention shifting without permission, without acknowledgement, and the balance of power had begun to tilt in a way he could not easily reverse. He opened his mouth again, ready to say something, to reassert authority. But the words felt hollow before they even formed, because deep down, he knew what the room was starting to understand, and it was a realization he had not prepared for, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but settles in slowly, undeniable and irreversible. By the time the second and third guests tasted the dish, the shift was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, their reactions mirroring the first in a quiet chain of realization that spread across the table and into the rest of the room. Conversations had stopped completely now, replaced by the soft sounds of cutlery and controlled breaths, as if no one wanted to disturb whatever had just taken hold of the moment. Claire continued working, already assembling the next element, her movements steady and unhurried, while behind her the kitchen staff stood in a silence that no longer carried skepticism, but something closer to respect, even restraint. Lucas did not move for several seconds, his gaze fixed not on the guests, not on the plate, but on Claire herself, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become personal. "That technique," one of the senior chefs murmured under his breath, barely audible, but enough to draw another glance. "That is not something you just pick up," and Lucas heard it. Even if he did not respond, Claire reached for another ingredient, something delicate, something that required exact timing, and handled it with the same confidence, the same absence of hesitation that had now become impossible to ignore. A woman at the far end of the table leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the dish more closely, then glanced toward Claire, and for a brief moment, recognition flickered across her face, faint but present. "Where have I seen that before?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. But the question lingered in the air, unanswered yet growing. Lucas stepped closer again, this time not to assert authority, but because something in him needed confirmation, needed proof of what his instincts were already suggesting. "Prepare another," he said, his voice quieter now, controlled but lacking the edge it once carried. And Claire did not look at him as she replied, "It is already in progress." And the simplicity of that answer landed heavier than any challenge could have. The guests exchanged glances, their earlier amusement replaced by a curiosity that now bordered on unease, as if they were beginning to realize that they had misread the entire situation from the start. Claire moved through the kitchen like someone who had nothing to prove, adjusting heat, layering elements, building flavors with a precision that felt almost effortless, and with each passing second, the idea that she was anything less than an expert became harder to sustain. Lucas watched her hands again, the small details now impossible to dismiss, the efficiency, the restraint, the deliberate control, and a memory surfaced more clearly this time, not fully formed, but enough to create discomfort. He had seen this before, not in person, but in something documented, something studied, something respected. The room remained silent as Claire completed the second dish, placing it down with the same care, the same quiet confidence, and when it was served, the reaction came faster this time, less hesitation, more certainty. "This is exceptional," one guest said, no longer trying to hide it, and another nodded in agreement, the words spreading quickly now, replacing the earlier laughter with something far more serious. Lucas exhaled slowly, the first visible sign that the moment had slipped beyond his control, and as he looked at Claire again, the question he had been avoiding could no longer be held back. "Who are you?" he asked, not loudly, but clearly enough that the entire room heard it. And for the first time, Claire paused, just for a second, her hands stilling as she considered the question, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet finality, as if she had been expecting it all along. She lifted her gaze toward him, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, and in that moment, the room leaned in, waiting, because whatever answer came next would not just explain the dish, it would redefine everything that had happened since she walked through the door. The question lingered in the air, heavier than anything that had been said that night, and for a moment, even the soft hum of the kitchen seemed to fade, as if the entire room had leaned into that single point of tension. Claire did not answer immediately, her gaze steady on Lucas, not confrontational, not defensive, simply present, and in that stillness, something about her composure carried more weight than any explanation could. A guest near the center table shifted in his seat, glancing between them, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet anticipation that now filled the room. Lucas held her gaze, waiting, but what unsettled him most was not her silence. It was the absence of any need to impress him, as if his approval had never been relevant to her at all. Claire turned slightly, reaching for a finishing touch on the dish she had just completed, her movements as precise as before, but slower now, deliberate, as if she understood that the moment had already changed and there was no need to rush toward its conclusion. "I cook," she said finally, her voice calm, almost understated, and a few guests exchanged confused glances, the answer too simple, too incomplete for the weight it carried. Lucas's expression tightened, not out of anger, but out of the growing realization that the truth was being revealed in fragments, not declarations. "That is not what I asked," he replied, his tone controlled, but now stripped of its earlier confidence, and Claire met his gaze again, her eyes steady, reflecting none of the tension surrounding her. "It is enough," she said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that made further questioning feel almost unnecessary. Yet Lucas could not let it go. Behind him, one of the senior chefs stepped closer, his attention fixed on the dish, then on Claire, then back again, as if trying to connect details that did not yet align. "Chef," he said softly, addressing Lucas but not taking his eyes off Claire. "The balance, the structure, the layering, this is not just experience." And he hesitated, searching for the right word. "This is mastery." And the word hung there, undeniable, forcing its way into the room's collective awareness. A woman at the far table suddenly straightened, her hand lifting slightly as if she had just remembered something important, her voice cutting through the silence, not loud, but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "Whitman," she said, almost to herself, but the name carried, echoing softly against the polished walls, and Claire did not react, not visibly, but Lucas did. His eyes narrowed, the memory finally locking into place, the articles, the interviews, the name that had once dominated conversations in the culinary world. A chef known for disappearing at the height of her career, leaving behind a legacy that others had spent years trying to replicate. The room shifted again, this time not with curiosity, but with recognition beginning to take shape, piece by piece. Lucas looked at her differently now, not with superiority, not even with skepticism, but with something far more complex, something closer to disbelief. "Claire Whitman," he said slowly, the full name carrying a weight that transformed the space around it. And this time, the reaction was immediate, a ripple of realization moving through the guests, whispers forming, eyes widening, the earlier narrative collapsing completely under the truth that had just surfaced. Claire placed the final garnish on the plate, her hands steady, her expression unchanged, and only then did she look up again, meeting Lucas's gaze one last time, not to challenge him, not to prove anything, but simply to acknowledge what had already become clear to everyone else. The room did not erupt, it did not gasp, it did not react loudly, because the realization was too heavy for that. Instead, it settled into a deep, collective silence, the kind that follows when arrogance meets something it cannot overpower, and in that silence, the hierarchy that had defined the evening quietly, irrevocably shifted. The name did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because the moment it was spoken, it carried a weight that settled into every corner of the room, and the silence that followed was no longer curiosity. It was recognition, the kind that arrives slowly, undeniable, reshaping everything that came before it. Claire Whitman stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if nothing significant had just happened, but around her, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The guests who had once leaned back in casual superiority now sat forward, their attention sharpened, their earlier assumptions dissolving into something closer to disbelief. Lucas did not speak immediately, and for a man who had built his reputation on control, that pause said more than any words could. His eyes moved from the dish to Claire, then back again, as if confirming the connection between the name and the work in front of him. And the more he looked, the clearer it became. The technique, the restraint, the precision, it was all there, not as a performance, but as something deeply ingrained. "You disappeared," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority it once carried. And Claire did not react to the statement, not with denial, not with confirmation, simply with the same steady composure she had maintained from the beginning. One of the guests, a man known for reviewing some of the most exclusive restaurants in the country, leaned forward, his expression no longer neutral but intent. "If that is really her," he said softly, though everyone could hear him, "then we are not watching a mistake. We are watching a standard." And the words shifted the room again, not dramatically, but enough to change how every plate, every movement, every second was now being perceived. Claire reached for the final component of what had become more than a single dish, her hands moving with the same quiet confidence. And as she plated the next course, the attention of the entire room followed every motion without distraction. There were no whispers now, no laughter, only a focused stillness that replaced the earlier noise. Lucas stepped closer, not to challenge, but to observe, his earlier certainty replaced by a careful attention that bordered on respect, though he had not yet admitted it. "Why did you not say who you were?" he asked, the question less confrontational now, more genuine, as if he needed to understand the choice. And Claire placed the final garnish with precision before answering, her voice calm, steady, because it was never necessary. And the simplicity of that answer landed harder than any explanation could have. Across the room, a woman lowered her glass slowly, her eyes fixed on Claire, as if seeing her for the first time, not as someone out of place, but as someone who had never needed the room's approval to begin with. The servers moved more carefully now, their earlier casual movements replaced by a quiet awareness, as if they understood that the moment had shifted into something far more significant than service. Lucas looked around the room briefly, taking in the faces that had once followed his lead, and for the first time, he saw something different. Not loyalty, not expectation, but a recognition that did not center on him. He turned back to Claire, his posture no longer rigid, his expression no longer certain. And in that moment, the dynamic that had defined the evening had fully reversed. Claire stepped back from the counter, not dramatically, not seeking attention, simply finished with what she had come to do. And as the final plate was carried into the dining room, no one spoke. The room did not need to react loudly, because the shift had already taken place, quiet, complete, and irreversible, leaving behind only the realization that everything they thought they understood had been proven wrong without a single word raised above a calm, steady tone. The final plate reached the table with a quiet precision, and no one rushed to speak, because the moment had already said everything that words would struggle to capture. The guests sat still, their earlier confidence replaced by something far more reflective, as if each of them was replaying the beginning of the evening in their minds. Measuring their own reactions against what they now understood, Claire remained near the kitchen, not stepping forward, not drawing attention, simply observing the room with the same calm presence that had never shifted. And in that stillness, her restraint carried more authority than any introduction could have. Lucas stood a few feet away, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer rigid, as if the structure he had built around himself had quietly loosened, piece by piece. He looked at the dishes leaving the kitchen, then back at Claire, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his gaze, only recognition. "You could have taken over this room in seconds," he said, his voice low, not for the audience, but for her. You could have said your name the moment you walked in. And Claire turned slightly, meeting his words without urgency, without the need to defend or explain. That would not have changed anything, she replied, her tone even. And the truth in that statement settled between them without resistance, across the dining room. The reactions continued, but they were no longer reactions of surprise. They were confirmations, guests nodding quietly, exchanging looks that spoke of shared understanding, the kind that comes when something undeniable has just been witnessed. One man set his fork down carefully, as if acknowledging that what he had just experienced deserved more than casual consumption, while another leaned back, exhaling slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by a thoughtful silence. The energy in the room had not faded. It had transformed, from spectacle into respect, from judgment into awareness. Lucas glanced toward the staff, noticing how they now moved differently, more deliberate, more attentive, as if the presence of Claire had reset something unspoken within the kitchen itself. The usual hierarchy, the familiar rhythm of command and response, had softened, replaced by a quiet alignment that did not require instruction. Claire stepped away from the station then, not with any sense of finality, but with the natural ease of someone who had completed what was necessary, her hands resting at her sides, her posture unchanged. She did not look for approval, did not wait for acknowledgement, because none of it had ever been the reason she accepted the challenge. Lucas watched her for a moment longer, then shifted his gaze to the room, taking in the silence, the attention, the unmistakable shift that had occurred under his watch but beyond his control. He understood now, not fully, but enough, that what had happened was not a challenge won or lost. It was a correction, a quiet rebalancing of something that had been tilted long before she walked through the door. One of the guests finally spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough to carry. That was not just skill, he said, his voice steady. That was perspective. And the word lingered, adding a new dimension to what the room had already begun to accept. Claire paused briefly as she turned toward the exit, her movement subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Lucas caught it, and for a second, he considered saying something more, something that might restore his place in the moment. But the words did not come, because he understood that some moments do not belong to those who try to control them. They belong to those who reveal them. And as Claire moved toward the door, the room did not stop her, did not call out, did not attempt to hold on to the moment, because what she had left behind did not require her presence to remain. It had already settled into the space, into the people, into the understanding that had quietly replaced everything that came before it, leaving only one undeniable truth behind, and that truth did not need to be spoken aloud. The door closed behind her without a sound, and yet its absence was felt immediately, as if something essential had just stepped out of the room, leaving behind a presence that lingered far heavier than before. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have anything to say, but because whatever words they might have chosen no longer felt sufficient for what had just unfolded. The plates remained in front of them, untouched for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of a quiet respect that had replaced the earlier need to react. Lucas stood still near the kitchen, his gaze resting on the empty space where Claire had been only seconds ago, and for a man who had built his identity on certainty, the silence now felt unfamiliar, almost instructional. He looked down at his own hands briefly, then back toward the dining room, noticing how the energy had changed in ways he could not command or reverse. One of the guests finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath, and lifted his glass, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement, as if recognizing something that had been missing before. "We misjudged her," he said quietly, not directing the statement at anyone in particular, but it did not need direction, because everyone in the room understood that it applied to all of them. A woman nodded beside him, her expression thoughtful. "Not just her," she added, her voice soft. "We misjudged the moment." And the distinction settled into the air, subtle but important, shifting the focus from a single mistake to a broader realization. Lucas walked forward then, not with the authority he had carried earlier, but with a slower, more deliberate pace, stopping at the table where the first dish had been served. He picked up a fork, not to prove anything, not to evaluate, but simply to experience what had already been confirmed by everyone else. The bite was measured, careful, and as he tasted it, his expression did not change dramatically, but something in his posture softened, a quiet acceptance replacing the resistance he had held onto for too long. He set the fork down slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment before lifting again, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the performance it once had. "We did not recognize what was in front of us," he said, and there was no defense in the statement, no attempt to soften it, only acknowledgement. The staff in the kitchen stood still, listening, their earlier tension replaced by a quiet attentiveness, as if they understood that what was happening now was not about correction, but about clarity. Lucas turned slightly, looking toward the entrance, though Claire was no longer there, and, for the first time that night, there was no attempt to reclaim control, only a recognition that some moments are not meant to be controlled, only understood. The guests began to move again, slowly at first. Conversations returning in lower tones, but they were different now, stripped of the casual superiority that had filled the room earlier, replaced by something more measured, more aware. A man at the far end of the table leaned back, his eyes lingering on the empty doorway, and said quietly, "She never needed this room." And no one disagreed, because the truth of that statement had already been proven beyond question. Lucas remained where he was for a moment longer, then turned back toward the kitchen, his movements more intentional now, more grounded, as if the foundation beneath him had shifted just enough to change how he stood. The dishes were cleared, the service resumed, but nothing about the